Yeah, so the benefits of perfect competition that we're going to talk about is that we get like the socially optimal level of production and prices. And so consumers and society, we would say, really benefit from perfect competition. But businesses would rather be monopolies, obviously, right? So from a business's perspective, you'd much rather be a monopoly. But in perfect competition, consumers and society as a whole, we would say probably do the best. Okay. All right. That'll come later. We'll talk about that later. So first I want to introduce you to the idea of market power and monopoly power. Okay. So we're going to start with this clip from Pulp Fiction, where Mia Wallace orders a $5 milkshake and John Travolta's character, Vincent Vega, is shocked by the price of the milkshake.
Martin and Lewis. Vanilla Coke.
Yummy.
You think I can have a sip of that?
Be my guest.
I gotta know what a $5 shake tastes like.
You can use my straw. I don't have cooties.
Yeah, but maybe I do.
Cooties I can handle.
All right. God damn, it's a pretty fucking good milkshake.
Told you.
I don't know if it was worth $5, but it's pretty fucking good.
Okay, so in this clip, she orders a $5 milkshake, and John Travolta's character is shocked by that, right? Now, something to think about is that the average restaurant charges about 300% over the marginal cost of ingredients as far as getting what they sell to you. It's about a 300% what we call a markup. So in those days, that $5 would be now like $9. So it's a pretty expensive milkshake, right? So that $5 milkshake we would expect cost that restaurant about like $1.50 to make. Marginal cost is about $1.50. They charge a 300% markup, gets close to $5, right? And so, market power is the ability to charge a price above marginal cost. Now I'm showing you how the Supreme Court defines it, because you can see how the legal definition, how it applies in economics. So the Supreme Court says that market power is the ability to raise prices above those that would be charged in a competitive market. Now you don't need to know that for economics class, but it's the same idea, because what is the price in a competitive market? In a perfectly competitive market, price is marginal cost. And so market power is the ability to charge above marginal cost. Okay. And so we call that a markup. That's what the average restaurant does. That's what most businesses do, right? They charge a markup. And so what we're going to learn is that all firms outside of perfect competition can charge a markup. Okay. So once you move outside of perfect competition, firms have some level of market power, and they can charge a markup. Okay. There's this separate concept called monopoly power. If you have monopoly power, you also have market power. But monopoly power is a little more specific. It's the ability to charge a price above average cost or average total cost without competitors entering the market. So in a perfectly competitive market, if you're making profit, if your price is above your average cost, we would expect competitors to enter and prices to fall to average cost in the long run. Monopolies don't have to worry about that. If you have a monopoly, you don't have to worry about competitors coming in and bringing long run profits down to zero. That's one of the key concepts in monopoly. So if you have a monopoly, you have monopoly power. And if you have monopoly power, you also have market power. But firms in market power don't necessarily have monopoly power. We're going to talk about that in a few slides. And so competitors can enter, long-run profits for monopolists. Monopolists can keep profits above zero in the long run. All right. So, a patent on a pharmaceutical drug, gives you monopoly power, which also allows you to charge a markup, right? And so again, if you have monopoly power, you also have market power. Right? Any questions? Yes. You do it?
I know I mentioned it a while back, but like price of plywood's through the roof.
Yeah.
Like lumber in general is.
Mhm.
People are still buying it.
Yeah.
So after, pandemic stuff is over with, and there shouldn't really be a shortage on it or anything like that, do you think the price is gonna go back down? Or since people are buying it at this price, are they still gonna keep that price?
Well, so demand affects prices for any firm, whether or not you're a monopoly. So if the demand for plywood is going to fall, then we would expect the price to fall, whether a monopoly owns it or a perfectly competitive firm owns it. Doesn't matter. And we're going to see how demand affects all companies, whether or not they're a monopoly.
Okay.
So just using the basics of supply and demand, if plywood demand is up right now because of the pandemic,
But that's what it's.
which is kind of weird, right? You would think it would be the opposite, but either way, if that's the case, then when demand falls, we would expect the price to fall, whether there's a monopoly or not. Okay. But monopoly is more about the relationship between cost and price, which we're going to talk about.
Because it's across like all the things, like Lowe's, Home Depot, all of them.
Yeah.
Like even your like smaller lumber stores, their prices are up there.
Are you sure it's not a supply shock from all the fires on the West Coast?
I'm not sure.
Fair enough. That's interesting though, but I don't think, so if it doesn't become clear, you ask me again, okay? Okay, so a lot of buyers, only one seller. This guy has monopoly power. He can charge pretty much any price he wants if people are willing to pay it. So demand still has an influence over this. People have to be willing to pay that price, but he doesn't have to settle at 10,000 or even 12,000. He can now charge 15,000 because there's a lot of buyers and he's the only seller. So he has monopoly power. All right. So I want to talk about the graphing a little because this is where it gets kind of confusing. So I put the tedious stuff in the middle of the lesson and then we'll end on a more interesting note. First thing to understand is that for monopoly or for any model outside of perfect competition, this is how we draw demand and marginal revenue for now. We assume that marginal revenue is always less than price. Now, why is that the case? Remember that in perfect competition, there's one price, horizontal demand curve that a firm faces. Firm faces perfectly elastic demand in perfect competition. If a firm in perfect competition charges the market price, it can sell as much as it wants. There's a specific amount that maximizes its profit, right? Where MR equals MC. Marginal revenue equals marginal cost. But in perfect competition, as long as you're charging the market price, sell as much as you want. Monopoly is different because a monopoly has the whole demand curve to itself. If the monopoly wants to sell more, it has to lower its price. And when you lower your price, you only get to charge one price for now. We call it, so we're talking about what's called single price monopoly, but you don't need to know that distinction just yet. This monopoly can only charge one price. So if it lowers its price, it's lowering the price on all of its units that it's selling. So the outcome of that scenario is that marginal revenue is going to decline twice as fast as price. In other words, we're always going to draw the marginal revenue curve to be starting at the same place as the demand curve, but it's going to be twice as steep. Now, I could prove this to you. I could spend 15 minutes talking about the math, doing the calculus of it. It's in the top hat. If you're interested and want to see, you can read about it. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on it, but just for now, take it for granted that in monopoly, marginal revenue is twice as steep as the demand curve.
And it can be negative showing?
Yes, because if they were to, once they start lowering their price below this point, let's say, they are now actually reducing their total revenue. Because now they've reduced their price so much that if I want to sell more and I have to lower my price to do so, I'm now reducing my total revenue. Because what is marginal revenue? It's the change in total revenue. So if marginal revenue becomes negative, your total revenue is actually decreasing. So total revenue is increasing all the way up until I get down to this, whatever price this is. And then lowering my price past that reduces my total revenue. But remember, we're not trying to maximize total revenue. We're trying to maximize profit. So the only scenario, well, so you'll never have to worry about this point right here. We'll talk about that in a second. So again, if we increase quantity, we have to sell all our units at the lower price. And so for linear demand curves, we have an intercept of demand and MR that are equal, but MR decreases twice as quickly as the demand curve. Horizontal intercept of MR is halfway between demand and the origin. Why is that the case? Well, if it declines twice as quickly, it hits zero in half the time, at half the quantity, right? So this distance from the origin to here should theoretically be the same as this distance. That's kind of technical. You don't really need to know that right now. But bottom line is that marginal revenue is separate from demand and it's twice as steep. So now, going over profits again. So let's take this slow. Can somebody tell, it's kind of there. Can somebody tell me what quantity this monopoly chooses to maximize its profit? The rule is where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. What quantity would that be? 4, right? It's already there for you. The marginal revenue intersects marginal cost. Quantity is 4. So here we are putting all these curves on one graph. How do we figure this out? First step. So this is just step by step what you do to analyze a graph like this. You choose the quantity where MR equals MC. Regardless of what market you're in, that's how a firm maximizes its profit. It's always going to choose quantity where MR equals MC. In this case, MR is not the same as price because it's monopoly. So it picks 4 units, but then it chooses its price from the market demand curve. It marks it up. So the marginal cost looks to be about $600, but the price ends up being $900 because the demand curve says if we're only selling 4 units, we can charge $900. We'll get 4 units demanded at charging $900. And so that difference between $900 and $600 is the markup. But the markup is not how we analyze profit. To analyze profit, we have to look at average cost. Because remember, marginal cost is just the cost of an individual unit. So the 4th unit costs $600 to make. But marginal cost is increasing as you produce more. So the average cost of production seems to be about, what is that, like $700? And so what we're doing is we're looking at the quantity and we're lining it up with the average cost curve. And so notice that the distance between that price of around 900 and the average cost of around 700 at the quantity of 4 multiplied by the quantity of 4 gives us that dark blue shaded rectangle. That is profit. The whole shaded area is total revenue. The lightly shaded area is total cost. What's left over, the dark blue at the top, that's profit.
Demand minus average cost times 1.
Yes, although demand in this case is where we're getting the price. So what you should really, so graphically you're looking at the demand curve, but the demand curve tells you what the price is. So the actual formula would be price minus average cost times quantity. But remember, what do demand curves tell us? They tell us what price we can charge at any given quantity. Questions? So this right here is fundamental. You do need to know this. You will be quizzed on this. Okay, I can tell you that. Something along these lines. Identifying the proper quantity, identifying the price, identifying the average cost, calculating profit. Okay. All right. Okay, so I hate looking at charts in class because it's kind of tedious. So we won't spend too much time on this. This is the same thing as the graph, except just represented in a chart. What do? We equalize marginal revenue and marginal cost. Where are they equal? At 4 units. At 4 units, marginal cost is 600. Marginal revenue is 600. That's it. Now you can see the way they're getting marginal revenue is they're looking at the change in total revenue from unit to unit. Same thing with marginal cost. They're looking at the change in total cost from unit to unit. What's the cost of producing 3 units? Well, it's 2,200. But what's the marginal cost of the 3rd unit itself? 400. Notice if we were to add up all the marginal costs of each unit, we'd get the total cost of 2,200. So I'm just showing this to you so you understand that marginal cost is like marginal anything is the individual cost or revenue from that specific unit. And it can be measured by just looking at the change in the total from unit to unit. Okay. This, you can kind of ignore most of these bullet points, except the 2nd and 3rd, right? If your marginal revenue is greater than your marginal cost, you need to be producing more. And if your marginal revenue is less than your marginal cost, you need to produce less. And the reason this is the case is because we assume that marginal revenue is going down and marginal cost is going up. So marginal revenue is above marginal cost. You should produce more until they intersect, or else you're missing out on profit. And so you could, look at profit on the margin if you wanted to. So we know that profit is total revenue minus total cost, but we could also look at it on the margin. We could say, well, my marginal revenue exceeds my marginal cost, right? So like the 2nd unit increases your profit by 700 because the marginal cost of the 2nd unit is only 300, whereas the marginal revenue of the 2nd unit is 1,000. So on the margin, you can see how we keep producing more until that marginal profit hits 0. Because we know that once marginal profit hits 0, it's going to start going negative. So marginal profit is just a way of thinking about the change in total profit from producing more, MR minus MC. And so once MR equals MC, we stop. Because if we produce more, we would assume that cost would exceed revenue, or marginal cost would exceed marginal revenue, and we'd be reducing our profit. So again, that golden rule in all of economics, MR equals MC, always. That's what we want if we're trying to maximize profit as a firm, no matter what market we're in. Just remember, price is only equal to marginal revenue in a perfectly competitive market, okay? MR equals MC is always going to be the golden rule. Stop and see if there are any questions. Okay. I can go back to the previous slide, but I mean, I don't know what you're going to get out of, So I went back to the previous slide for you. The bottom line from this one is just, this is just another way of looking at it piece by piece on a chart instead of on a graph. Okay. And remember, we're not maximizing total revenue, we're maximizing total profit. So marginal revenue equals marginal cost is how we get that profit maximizing quantity. The first bullet point, I you don't really need, like, that might confuse you. I apologize that it's there. It's true that eventually marginal revenue will turn negative, and so you see that with like the 8th unit, but you're stopping at the 4th unit anyway, so it doesn't really matter. Okay, because again, we're not maximizing total revenue, we're maximizing profit. Okay. Okay, so just a couple exercise, just a couple exercises, kind of saw the answer. Well, it is what it is. What's the monopolist optimal price and output level? You tell me. So this is a question you would have on a quiz in the final. And it should be easy, right? This is an easy, this is something that we can get down pretty easily. What's the monopolist optimal price and output level? So remember, produce where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. But then once you've picked that quantity, look up to the demand curve to find the price. Great, excellent. The answer is B. So remember, the monopolist does not charge $3. The monopolist charges a markup. So the monopolist doesn't have to charge $3. People are willing to pay $16.50 for 40 units. There's no reason for the monopolist to charge marginal cost. So the answer is nice. The answer is B. Okay. 2 steps. Select the quantity where MR equals MC. Select the price from the demand curve at that quantity. Very straightforward. Questions? All right. Roll. What profit does the monopolist earn? So we know the price is $16.50. We know the quantity is 40. $16.50 minus whatever the average cost is times the quantity would give us the profit. So $16.50 minus something times 40 is going to give us our profit. How many responses we got? 5, 6, 7. Nice. Oh shit! Wait, hold on. Let's see. Let's see what the responses are. Okay, interesting. 540. I'm wondering where that's coming from. It is 420. Nice. Yeah.
How did you know that? Because I did like the top hat, so I knew that was the answer. But like, how did you?
Yeah, good question. So, if I were to draw on the chalkboard, would you be able to see it? I just drew on the chalkboard right here. Yeah, so 1650 minus average cost of $6. And so the way we know that the average cost is $6 is because we look at the quantity of 40, and we can see that at the quantity of 40, the average cost curve, that point on the average cost curve that intersects with that quantity of 40 is $6. So average cost when you produce 40 units is $6. So that's it. That's all you got to do. Once you pick the quantity, everything else comes from that. Everything, all of this, all these cost curves, price, they're all what we call a function of quantity. So once you've nailed down quantity being 40, all of your curves are just on that vertical line. That's what you're looking at. So we know the marginal cost is 3. We know marginal revenue is 3. We know average cost is 6. We know price is $16.50 because we're stuck to that $40 quantity. Any other questions? Okay. So, away from the more technical stuff, onto something a little more maybe easier to comprehend. Let's talk about allocative efficiency. So monopolies are allocatively inefficient. The way economists define what is socially optimal is where welfare is maximized. So where the sum of consumer and producer surplus are maximized, right? Total surplus, total social welfare, whatever you want to call it. And the idea with that is that for that to happen, the marginal benefit to buyers of the last unit sold should equal the marginal cost of production. Now, of course, this is, recall from externalities that the demand curve represents the marginal benefit to buyers. Okay. Allocative efficiency occurs where demand intersects marginal cost. And so this happens in perfect competition because demand and marginal revenue are the same, and then they hit marginal costs and we get that. The problem is the monopoly has its own marginal benefit curve, which is marginal revenue. So whereas buyers have the demand curve, which is their marginal benefit, the monopoly has its own marginal benefit curve, which is marginal revenue. And so the monopoly, in its own best interest, produces where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. But what society wants, what's best for society, is for price to equal marginal cost, for where demand intersects marginal cost. And so monopolies don't get us the efficient outcome. They produce less than the socially optimal amount and charge a higher price. So the monopoly charges P0 and produces a quantity Q0. Whereas in perfect competition, or thinking about what would be best for social welfare, Q1 would be produced. And of course, it would be P1, it's not there, but you can imagine a lower price below P0. And so what we get is that this, can I annotate? Maybe. No, I don't think I can do that. What we get is this scenario where this area here, this dotted line, this like kind of misshapen triangle here, that's deadweight loss created by the monopoly, because that's consumer surplus and producer surplus that are just gone because of the monopoly. Because we have a scenario where buyers between Q0 and Q1 are willing to pay more than the marginal cost of producing the good. So in an efficient market, if you're willing to pay more than the marginal cost of producing the good, you're able to get that good. But the monopoly is not producing more than Q0. And so that distance between Q0 and Q1 is a level of quantity that the monopoly is not producing. In perfect competition, we would get that, but a monopoly doesn't get us that. And so there's a loss of social welfare. There's deadweight loss created through the allocative inefficiency of the monopoly. Any questions about that? What's that? Can't hear you. So so what about the deadweight loss?
What did you say?
Yeah, so so if we were to take like Q0 to Q1, and then I wish I could draw on this. If we were to think about this as deadweight loss, let me just, I'll Google, I'll show you. Monopoly deadweight loss. It'll make sense if I show you this. What's one that makes the most sense? There's the deadweight loss. That yellow and that red. So if you were to take this, see how it aligns? That yellow and red, that yellow is consumer surplus that disappears. The red is producer surplus that disappears. And so that yellow and red together would be the deadweight loss. So that's value that's not being created because that's a portion of the demand curve that's above marginal cost, but people are not being paired. They're not buying the good. They can't buy the good past Q0. So we'd say that's inefficient. That's the whole point of markets. The reason economists like markets. Yes, we're going to talk about price ceilings as a way to regulate monopoly, actually. So very good question. Price ceilings can efficiently regulate monopoly because monopolies charge above equilibrium price. We'll talk about that in a sec. But yeah, so where was I with this? The point of markets is to pair people who have a willingness to pay higher than the marginal cost of something. And that's how we exchange things. That's why trade happens. That's how we create value in an economy. Monopoly reduces that level of value because you have people who are willing to pay more than the marginal cost, but the monopoly won't do it because the monopoly is trying to maximize its profit. Okay. So in summary, monopolies have both market power and monopoly power, which means they charge above marginal cost and charge above average total cost without fear of competition. They are allocatively inefficient, so they produce less output than is socially optimal and charge a higher price, which creates deadweight loss. Like all firms, they produce where MR equals MC, but they charge a higher price. That's the markup. They can arise from market forces, or they can arise from government intervention. We talked about this on Monday with things like patents and copyright laws, but things like natural monopoly and how, or if a company, you know, like De Beers Diamond Corporation owns all the land where all the diamonds are, you know, that's not government intervention. That's just a company owns all the land where all the diamonds are. So they have a monopoly. Right? They have some benefits. Economies of scale allow for cheap production. Innovation, things like pharmaceuticals, right? Pharmaceutical companies require monopoly so that they are incentivized to do research. Any questions? All right. So here are a few potential solutions to monopoly. Government buyout of patents. Maybe some drug creates too much positive externality for its formula to say private knowledge. So the government buys it out and makes it public knowledge. Well, what happens? They've bought out the patent's gone. Now, instead of charging, you know, $10 a pill, maybe the price goes down to 5 cents a pill, right? Because that's how much it actually costs to produce an individual pill. And the only reason why pharmaceuticals cost more than their marginal cost is because patents protect the company and the company gets to mark it up so that it can recoup its investment. But if you make the patent public, you know, you compensate the company for the patent, make the patent public, and then, you know, the price goes down pretty drastically, right? It moves from monopoly into a competitive market. Now, this would be funded with taxes. So there's a trade-off. You'd have to show that the tax money spent buying out the patent would be outweighed by the positive social benefits of getting this thing out. So for example, the tax money, the tax burden of subsidizing the coronavirus vaccine, I think most people and most economists would agree that that tax burden is far outweighed by the GDP loss from not getting people vaccinated, right? You might have prizes to reward research, right? Government funds research grants to incentivize researchers, and then the research becomes public knowledge. Maybe you break up the monopoly. Maybe you break it up into a bunch of little companies, right? Price ceilings. Now, this is an interesting one. Would a price ceiling necessarily create a shortage if there's a monopoly? Any thoughts? Yes. Very interesting question. There's not quite a shortage in the monopoly because the shortage means that the price is so low that quantity demanded exceeds quantity supplied, a monopoly is raising the price. So they are artificially keeping the supply low. So it's not quite a shortage already, but there's a very similar concept here. Let me show you. If you put a price, remember, the monopoly is charging above what the theoretical equilibrium price would be in an efficient competitive market. So if you place a price ceiling below the monopoly price, but above the efficient competitive market price, you can actually force the monopoly to increase its production. And so what it does is it kind of turns that marginal revenue curve into like this flat line that goes here and hits marginal cost here. And so ultimately, now the technicalities of this are not super important. The idea though is that if you place a price ceiling on a monopoly that's below the monopoly price, but still above the competitive equilibrium price, you can get the monopoly to, in its best interest, produce a higher quantity. And so this is an instance where a price ceiling can actually increase societal welfare if you're dealing with a monopoly. You don't want to put price ceilings on competitive markets. It's a disaster. So you don't put price ceilings on things like food. Creates the famous red lines, right? Because food is really close to the natural equilibrium price because food is very competitive. But there is a case to be made that a price ceiling on something where only one company controls it could maximize social welfare. Okay, that's the idea. All right. So that's one way of several ways you could regulate a monopoly. Another way to regulate monopoly is actually to subsidize it. If you give the monopoly money, it'll produce more. So what we do with vaccines is we subsidize, right? Okay. Any questions? Okay. Okay, so this, I'll show you like 30 seconds of this real quick, just to get a point across.
47 years in prison is what they wanted. $8.37 million worth of fines and fees is what they wanted. And a felony. They want to brand me a felon. I mean, I got in the way of the 28th largest company in the world, and this giant stepped on me, and I felt it.
Microsoft has accused Eric Lundgren of creating thousands of illegal copies of its software. He argues he was only using it to extend the lifespan of old PCs.
Microsoft took the stand and said, we think that Eric Lundgren infringed our IP and cost us millions of dollars, £1 million worth of e-waste every year. The United States is the largest contributor to electronic waste, which is the fastest growing waste stream in the world. To put it in perspective, 126 Empire State Buildings worth of e-waste are actually created every single year. And all of that waste, you'd think it would be recycled somewhere when we throw it in the trash. No, 15% is recycled. And then 85% is either exported or put in a landfill, leaching harmful chemicals in our water table like lead and mercury, bromine, cadmium. And these harmful chemicals are affecting us in a negative way. Now, the majority that gets exported goes to third world countries. They're burning this waste just to try to find little scraps of metal that they can.
Okay, so let's talk about this real quick. Monopoly power makes it easier to create negative externalities. What's happening here? So what happened with this gentleman is he was trying to extend the life of old PCs by making these restore disks, okay? And he created tens of thousands of them. They're bootleg. So what he did was he made these disks that can essentially, fix people's PCs, right? He infringed on Microsoft's intellectual property. Microsoft has patent protections on this software. What he was trying to do, now I'm sure he was making money. I don't know what his incentives are deep down. He went to prison for 15 months over this. Microsoft wanted him to go away for like life. What he was doing was he was trying to reduce a negative externality by extending the life of hardware so that it wouldn't be thrown out and pollute, right? The problem is Microsoft has monopoly power through its copyrights and patents. So the government gives Microsoft monopoly power. Now there's a trade-off. There's a reason for that. Microsoft provides an excellent service. Microsoft revolutionized home ownership, home usage of computers. They're a phenomenal company. But at the same time, they create negative externalities by producing things that leach chemicals and create costs to society. And so he was punished very severely for trying to reduce these negative externalities. He mentioned he's taking on the 28th largest company in the world. So one of the problems with monopoly power is that the forces of competition do a very good job of regulating things. And when you don't have that, you get problems like this. So Microsoft creates a lot of waste. What can we do about that? They have monopoly power. This is one of the problems with monopoly power, is that you can't really, it's very hard to hold companies with monopoly power accountable for things like negative externalities. And so I thought this was interesting. It's like 20 minutes long, so I'm not going to show all of it, but it's pretty interesting how you can tie in externalities to the monopoly issue. So now we're going to talk real quick about just kind of the in-between markets between monopoly and perfect competition. These things that we consider to be imperfect competition, where there's some level of competition, but it's not perfect. Monopolistic competition is probably the most common one. Most markets are like this. Similarities to perfect competition would be things like there are many firms, little to no entry barriers. Because there's little to no entry barriers, long-run economic profits tend toward zero. Firms have no monopoly power under monopolistic competition because they are not free from competitors entering the market and bringing prices down to average cost. But there are some similarities to monopoly. We graph it like a monopoly. So that's important. We graph it like a monopoly. We have that downward sloping demand curve with the separate marginal revenue curve. They charge a markup. They charge a price above marginal cost. They have market power. What's unique about monopolistic competition is that the products are differentiated but similar. So think about ice cream.
Off-brand cereal.
What's that?
Off-brand cereal.
Exactly. So cereal is a monopolistically competitive market. Now, I would imagine that ultimately it's probably oligopoly because General Mills probably owns like most of them. But yeah, so like the products are differentiated but similar. So there are different kinds of ice cream. I really like Ben & Jerry's ice cream. Well, I used to really like it. I had to cut back. But you know, similar products, right? They're relatively substitutable, but not quite the same. So some level of brand loyalty, some level of patent protection on your brand exists. Think about restaurants on High Street, right? They all sell food, but the food's different. There's a lot of restaurants. And the barriers to entry aren't super high. You got to find a space, but it's not a super high barrier to entry. Restaurants are moving in and out. So you'll notice that under oligopoly, which we'll probably save for Friday, businesses don't move out in and out very often, but restaurants are constantly moving in and out of Morgantown. Morgantown's restaurant market is monopolistically competitive. Okay. So most firms are in this kind of market. Now, I would argue that see some people writing, so I will post these slides. Okay. I would argue that the hard seltzer market is monopolistically competitive. Notice now, I would say drinks in general, beer is monopolistically competitive. Hard seltzer is probably monopolistically competitive. You know, maybe if I dug deep, maybe I'd find out that like four of these are like owned by like the same general company, but I don't think that's true. Either way, Notice how White Claw kind of pioneered this market. But White Claw couldn't maintain a monopoly. A bunch of other brands started entering the hard seltzer market, right? We would say that it's probably monopolistically competitive. We expect firms to move in and out of this market. You know, if you're already making soda or alcohol in some way, then the barriers to entry for you are probably pretty low. The barriers to entry for a layperson depends. I mean, anybody can make beer and wine in their home now. Maybe you can make hard seltzer at home. You know, all you'd have to do is use a soda stream and put some like vodka in it, right? So low barriers to entry. We see new companies entering all the time, and now everybody's making hard seltzer. Monopolistic competition. All right. I will leave you with that. If you have any questions, I'll throw up the prompt, or you can come up to me at the end right now. All right. Enjoy the rest of your day and Thursday, and I'll see you on Friday.
Great. So my first question. All from the soda, but about how much is the funnel worth?
The final is worth the same as all the other quizzes, except it can replace if you get a higher grade than your lowest quiz grade, then it would replace that.
So that's cool.
So it can be worth 2 quizzes.
That's neat.
Yeah.
And then I was looking on Heat Campers, and I think the stuff from last week that I already kind of talked to you about.
Yeah.
I think that showed up as a 0.
Okay. So that was your, okay. Yeah. Let me,
I believe it was. It said like in 9 and 10, so I think that's just like the pack back